Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you. I'm glad to be in this panel with Amir, someone I'd known for a very long while, and with you, moderator, and of course, who is responsible for this invitation. Now, the question that we've been asked is whether there would be a new world order as a result of this health crisis, as a result of COVID-19. Before attempting to answer this question directly, let me draw your attention what I see as two trends, two developments which I think would impact upon the future, and therefore upon the question of the global order. Number one, COVID-19 health crisis has exposed the failures and flaws in the Western paradigm to some extent. It has exposed the shortcomings of countries like the United States of America, Britain, Italy, Spain, France, a number of other countries. And this, I think, is significant. It is very significant that governance of these countries have been brought to the fore, and they have been subjected to scrutiny. They have been subjected to evaluation. And one could argue that there is a certain degree of erosion of respect for these governments, the elites that govern these societies. People now realize that they have not been able to handle the crisis. If you look at the number of deaths of these countries, America in particular, and Britain, if you look at the number of infections, and if you look at the impact upon the economy, society as a whole, they seem to be in dire straits. And this, I think, has impacted upon a lot of people. Because after all, for quite a long while, the West was seen as the model of development, seen as the paragon of all the virtues and values associated with modernization, with transformation, and so on. But now that has been called into question. I would like to emphasize here that the decline of the West, countries in the United States of America in particular, is not something new. It had been developing over a period of time. In the case of the United States of America, I would argue that for perhaps at least 2-3 decades, this has been happening. It is, in a sense, ironical that as soon as the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union crumbled, the United States, which thought that it would be able to dominate the world, at that point, actually, its decline began. There was the rise of China, challenge from non-state actors against the United States of America. And if you look at the historical past, one can argue that immediately after the Second World War, when the US asserted its power and it was the dominant force, there was already the development of the non-aligned movement. That was a challenge to US dominance. And you had the Soviet Union, which was an ideological challenge to the United States of America. So it's not as if they've had an easy time. It's not as if they've been able to dominate the world at will. So this is their situation. What this crisis, this health crisis has done, what the virus has done, is to, in a sense, bring these weaknesses to the fore in such a dramatic manner. Because if you look at health crisis and how it impacts upon people, It is very direct. People understand this. They may not understand an ideological challenge to superpower, but health crisis, it is something that people are able to relate to very easily. So if this health crisis, the coronavirus, has done anything at all, it is, I think, to show how hollow the dominant Western powers are, what their weaknesses are, who their elites are, and what their shortcomings are. So that's one trend. The second trend is the opposite of the first trend. If you look at countries in East Asia, starting with China, and then of course there is Korea, there is Japan, you look at Vietnam, you look at countries like Malaysia, to some extent Singapore, and other countries in the region, one could argue that by and large, countries in East Asia, Northeast Asia, and Southeast Asia have done better in handling this crisis. They've done better in terms of their approach to various dimensions of this crisis. You find that they've been able to curb the rate of deaths, infections. They've been able to get out of this very difficult situation much faster than Western countries that I named earlier. They have been able to restore a certain degree of normalcy, like what has happened in China, including the epicenter, Wuhan. And if you look at Korea, South Korea, it has done fairly well. Vietnam, it has kept its death rates very low. And my own country, which is seldom highlighted, I think it has done quite well. There have been 100 plus deaths, which is a number that is not shocking. And at the same time, the infections have been 5,000 plus. And generally, we have done quite well in terms of managing the overall situation, including the economy that is related to this crisis. But here again, I would like to highlight that the performance of these countries is not new. For the last 2 or 3 decades, they've been doing fairly well. They've been doing quite well economically, politically. You just look at these two dimensions very quickly. Economically, one can argue that China's phenomenal rise has been almost a miracle. If you look at its past, its historical past, how it has emerged. Look at Korea, South Korea, and if you look at Japan, of course, has always been a major actor. Vietnam has done very well. So you find that there are countries in this region that have done very well economically and politically. You find that the transition of power, the way in which political stability has been maintained, all these countries that I mentioned just now, they seem to have a fairly respectable in terms of political transition. So they have done quite well in the past. And now you have this crisis highlighting their strength as a group. So just the contrast of what has happened in the West. And this brings me to a very important question. What am I suggesting? Am I suggesting here that the New World Order is going to be East Asia centric? It's going to be something that will be linked to this part of the world? Well, I think to some extent that is a factor that we must take into account. Talk of the New World Order, it's not going to be Eurocentric. It's not going to be centered around the United States of America anymore. The decline of the United States of America is something that is obvious to most people. So in terms of power, the shift in power, both economic power and political power related to economic power, there's going to be a change. And East Asia, I think, will play a very big role. And China in particular, we know that, will play a very big role. Now, let me very quickly address this issue about China. Because there are a lot of people who would say, oh, China is going to be the next hegemon. It's going to be like the United States of America. It will dominate the world. It will control other countries and so on. I would like to highlight two aspects about China, which I've talked about in the past. Number one, if you look at China in relation to the United States of America, the US represented a sort of convergence of power, which was historically unique. I don't think that's going to happen again. So we do not need to fear the type of dominance represented by the United States of America. What do I mean by this? At the end of the Second World War, the US combined nearly every dimension of power: political power, security power, economic power. It was also the leader of information power, of the entertainment world, culture, almost everything that you can think of. And that is a unique convergence of power, which happened a second time when the Soviet Union crumbled in 1991. Again, that combination of power. But on both occasions, the US was not able to sustain it. First occasion, as I alluded to earlier, you had challenge from the non-aligned movement and from the Soviet Union and the Soviet-related states. The second occasion, from China, from the non-state actors related to Islam and other groups. And after that, you know what had happened, because even immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had the crisis in Yugoslavia, which I'm sure our ambassador here will be able to talk about. And that was a challenge to the sort of power structure. And then you had, of course, Iraq and all the rest of it. So they've never really been able to dominate as such. Nonetheless, it has been their aim, their ambition to exercise total, absolute dominance. But that unique circumstance that I referred to, Second World War and what had happened then and what had happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it is not something that will present itself. It is unique. It was the product of a certain situation, because as you know, in the case of the Second World War, the end of the Second World War, the United States was the only victor that emerged in truly triumphant fashion from the war. It was on the winning side, but unlike Britain, which is also on the winning side, but it was devastated by the war, but the United States was triumphant. So that sort of situation will not present itself again. So I have no fear of China combining the various dimensions of power in order to dominate the world. And to reinforce that point, if you look at what is happening today, for instance, China is economically strong, yes. But in terms of military power, in this sort of new situation, Russia is stronger than China in terms of its military power, in terms of its military muscle, and even in terms of culture. China doesn't have the same impact upon the global culture as Korea. Korea has a much greater impact. So you find that power is actually more diffused now. You have different countries exercising different dimensions of power, which means that you don't have one country dominating the various aspects of power. That I think is good for humankind. That there's no one country that's able to dominate power in a total manner. Economic power, political power, cultural power, information power, and all the rest of it. So that situation is welcome. Let us also not forget that China, even in past, when it was right at the apex of its power, never sought to dominate the world. This is something that is historically well grounded, something that no one can dispute. That when they had the biggest navy in the world, they did not seize 1 inch of anyone else's territory. And right through, you just compare China to Spain and Portugal around the same time. If you look at the dynasties that dominated China compared to Spain and Portugal, they tried to dominate the world. They killed thousands of people. But in the case of China, they never conquered other people's territory. And if you look at the boundaries of China today, These are the boundaries that China has had for more than 1,000 years. In other words, it hasn't expanded and conquered other people's land. It has had border disputes. China has always been concerned about its borders. It's true. But as a nation, China has been quite well behaved in terms of its exercise of power. And I think if you look at even modern times, dispute with India, even after winning that McMahon Line dispute, the Chinese withdrew. And even in the case of Vietnam, a couple of skirmishes, but after having achieved what they wanted, they decided to go back. So I think one has to understand these aspects of Chinese political behavior and not come to wild conclusions that China is going to dominate and conquer and all the rest of it, because there's no evidence to support that. So I don't fear the rise of China. China will be powerful, but there'll be others, and they will work with others. And if you look at the One Belt, One Road project, it is basically an attempt to work with others, to enhance other economies, to strengthen cooperation at the international level. Now, having said that, let me also argue, and this is towards my conclusion, that it is not China's rise that I fear. What I see as an opportunity at this moment is this transition. The unipolar world is coming to an end. US dominance is coming to an end. Western dominance is coming to an end. It will not return for a long, long while. That power is coming to an end. We are moving into a multipolar world. That's obvious. Where you have different centers of power. As I said, Russian military power, Korean cultural power, Chinese economic power, and various other aspects of power. Moving into a multipolar world where power will be diffused, different centers of power, and you don't have a hegemon. Now, in this period of transition where there's no hegemon, multipolar world, I think various other actors should play an active role. And this must include not only state actors, but also non-state actors. Civil society groups and others must try to shape the world that is emerging. They should try to shape this new world order, and they can play a role. I would like to suggest here that in this situation where power is diffused, multipolar world, there are a few things that we may want to focus upon. I'm referring particularly to countries in Asia. I think we should, number one, try to ensure that the world that is going to emerge is a world which is not dominated by the crass individualism of Western culture, on one hand, or the authoritarianism, the vulgar authoritarianism associated with certain countries. Both are not options for us. Both are not choices. We don't want both extremes. We want a different path. And I would argue that neither authoritarianism on the one hand or crass individualism on the other, we choose the middle path. Middle path is part of our tradition, not just Islam, where it's very clear, but also Confucianism and the other traditions, Hinduism, Sikhism, very much part of all our traditions. The middle path means equilibrium, means balance. Middle path is not avoiding extremes in the superficial sense. It is choosing a path that reflects equilibrium, balance, which is very much part of our philosophies. So I think that's something that we have to do. Number one, very important. Number two, it also means trying to evolve societies, this new emerging world, a new world order, if you like, which is not just focused upon rights. We have to try to evolve a world which is also very concerned about responsibilities, rights and responsibilities. Responsibilities are very important, very much part of our traditions. I'm not talking of duties. Duties dominated by the state that defines duties. That's something that we don't want. Neither do we want the type of notion of individual rights, which is associated with a particular culture. It is basically the post-Enlightenment European culture. Here we are talking about societies which would choose a different approach where you have responsibilities, you emphasize responsibilities. Also very important. Responsibilities are related to the notion of one's trust, amana, that's linked to responsibility. Amana is a very important dimension of our cultures and philosophies. And if you look at even this crisis that has happened, maybe it's related to amana, the way in which we look at our natural environment, animals, and all the rest of it, perhaps that's part of it. And amana perhaps is also related to things like our relationship to what we eat and how we eat and all the rest of it. It's all part of amana. Responsibility is very important. We have to instill that notion of responsibility in future generations. Rights linked to responsibilities. Because there can be no rights in our philosophies that is not inspired by responsibilities. A right that is worthwhile is only worthwhile because it emerges from a deep sense of responsibility. I defend the right to free speech because of my deep sense of responsibility. So I think that is a relationship that we're trying to develop in this new world order. And likewise, in the new world order, I think there has to be equitable distribution of power, not just economic power or political power, but also cultural power, information power, intellectual power, more equitable distribution, so that no one would be left behind in the real sense of the word, not just as a slogan, that people who are weaker, who have been disenfranchised, who have been marginalized, they would also enjoy their rights, their responsibilities, they'd be able to play their roles. Equitable distribution is very important. But for all these things to happen, equitable distribution of power, rights and responsibilities, and also a certain notion of balance of the middle path. We need certain accompanying values. These values have to emerge. We cannot have a civilization. This was in some ways, unfortunately, the dominant characteristic of Western civilization. We talked about freedom, but basically it was power, it was wealth. It was this that dominated Western civilization. Anyone who tells me that the United States and America in particular is more concerned about freedom than about power, I think the person doesn't understand. If you look at the way the US has behaved all along, it has been more obsessed with power than look at what they did in Algeria, supporting the forces that were against freedom, what they did in the case of Palestine, what they did in the case of Iran. There are numerous examples in history. So the point I'm making is, let's have a civilization that focuses upon real values, including freedom and justice. Justice is very important. And values like compassion. Compassion should be so much a part of governance. It should emerge. Kindness, love. These are values that should be emphasized. Now, these values will only emerge in a different sort of setting, not the setting which is obsessed with power and wealth and prestige and fame. These are things which, in all our religious philosophies, we have looked at these things as things that do happen, but we have always been critical. And I think it is important that civilization as a whole moves in a different direction. Maybe the COVID-19 crisis is a reminder to all of us. Pause, ponder, to look at our civilization in a different way. Perhaps to evolve something which reflects our true humanity. That is